Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's session of the Somali Week Festival, co-hosted by UCL and SOAS. We welcome you to tonight's discussion that's going to be paying respects to two of the founding fathers of Somali Studies, Professor Sheikh Samatar and Professor Hussein Adam Tanzania. Panel consists tonight of some esteemed members that are each in their own right really aware of the works that Dr. Tanzani and Dr. Sheikh Samatar have contributed, and they're each going to say some remarks about what they think the most memorable contributions are that each of these scholars have made. So to begin with, Dr. Laura Hammond. Dr. Laura Hammond is a reader in development studies at SOAS. She's been researching food security, conflict, migration, and diaspora in the Somali context for more than 25 years. Right next to her is Professor Ahmed Samatar, who's the founding dean of the Institute for Global Citizenship at Macalester College in the States. He's worked very closely with Dr. Tanzania, so he's going to be making some useful contributions in this discussion. And then to my immediate right, we have Professor Abdi Samatar, who's a professor of geography at the University of Minnesota, author of many books, including the recently published Africa's First Democrats, and we're going to be engaging with the questions about Somali political leadership later on. So welcome to each and every one of them. We have 10 minutes for each panelist, and we're going to begin with Laura.
Okay, thank you. I had the privilege of meeting and knowing both Sheikh Samatar and Hussein Adam, Hussein Tanzania. I don't know whether everyone in the audience is fully familiar with both of their vast corpus of work, but it might be worth highlighting a few of those things. I mean, as Idil said, they were both founders of the Somali Studies International Association. They were both had long-standing careers as academics, having written a variety of really seminal works. For Said, probably he's best known for his book Somalia, Nation in Search of a State, which was published in 1987 and is still used regularly by my students, and I'm sure by yours as well. And many, many other books. Hussein also was the author of at least 9 different books, including seminal, quite important compilations of papers that were presented at the SSIA conferences. One was called Mending Rips in the Sky, and another was, what was the one called?
Tyranny to the Fifth.
There was From Tyranny to Anarchy, The Somali Experience, which was a book that he wrote himself, but as well a kind of compilation that he did with Richard Ford on some of the papers that came out of the conference. But I thought I wanted to say more about them as people, as characters those of us who knew them well, and I was trying to think about how to do that. And I came across actually a speech that Said gave in honor of Hussein in 2007 at the SSIA conference, which was in Columbus. And one of the things that, if you knew Said, you knew that he had a wicked sense of humor, absolutely very sharp and biting. And so he gave this almost a roast of Hussein. And one way of both getting you to get a flavor of who Said was as a person, and as well who Hussein was as a person, is to hear a little bit of that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to just read a few extracts of that speech that he said. He first starts off by he says, the title of my remarks, this is Said speaking, so I'm channeling Said now, spirit medium here tonight. The title of my remarks goes something like this. The title is Hussein Adam, How an Ordinary Boy Became an Extraordinary Man. But first a disclaimer on behalf of Hussein Adam. He did not want this trouble, meaning this speech. He was dragged into it, kicking and screaming. He did agree that it is time that Somalis learn to honor their own, but he wanted the honoring to go to someone else. So he rattled out a string of names. What about so-and-so? No, I ain't interested, I replied. What about this, that, or the other? No, I ain't interested, Said said. After 6 months of speechifying, in which I talked at him, around, over him, under him, the man began to fear I might talk the hind legs off of him. So reluctantly, he finally relented, and I rejoiced. He goes on to say, to talk about the very early days of Hussein's life. Hussein was born in Tanzania, 50 miles away from Hemingway's The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and the Tanzanian city of Arusha, in April 1943. His father was a Somali born from Hargeisa, and his mother had a mixed pedigree of being Maasai and Indian Muslim. And then Said says, according to my passport, nobody knows for sure the year of my birth because I was born among the camels, and camels do not keep records. According to the arbitrary date on my passport, I too was born in 1943. Obviously, genius has an excellent sense of timing. Thus, 1943 heralded the birth of two stars, Said and Hussein. Then, I won't go through all of this, but then he goes on where he talks about an experience that Hussein told him about, in which he was mocked by one of his school headmasters in Tanzania for being Somali. He and four other students, I think, were from Somalia, and he was making fun of the fact that they came from Somalia. That was a place that was, as he called it, barren, desert-like, didn't have the green lushness that many parts of Tanzania have. But rather than being humiliated and shamed by this headmaster speaking about his home country, even though he was born in Tanzania in that way, Hussein turned it around in a different way. He said, this is Hussein now speaking, he said, it was that public humiliation that I resolved to love sand and deserts. I resolved that at the end of my studies, however long it takes, I would go straight to help Somalia, even though I did not speak Somali, whereas my Swahili was more than excellent. The humiliation made me love everything Somali, the beaches, the sand, the anthills, cities like Mogadishu, Hargeisa, Barrow, Beledweyne, Bosaso, and Garowe, and also love the food, and above all, really love Somali women. To which Said says, amen, I second that sentiment. I hope that they take that as being really among the first Somali feminists. I'm sure that's what they meant. It goes on to describe Hussein's trajectory. He did his BA at Princeton. He then did a master's degree in Makerere University in Uganda, which was at that time, and still is, very much considered to be a kind of the Harvard of East Africa. He then went to Harvard and did another MA and a PhD. His PhD dissertation title was on the social and political thought of Frantz Fanon. And then he goes on to have a very illustrious career, publishing over 9 different books. As I said, most famously probably From Tyranny to Anarchy, The Somali Experience. He was one of the founders of the Somali Studies International Association. He was regularly consulted with on all manner of issues relating to Somali culture, politics, which we'll be discussing later on this evening. So to go back to Said's comments, he says, and just to finish up, he says, Hussein officially migrated to his beloved Somalia in 1974, where he began a new life in a new country. As it turned out, beloved Somalia was not always kind to him. During the long reign of Mohammed Siad Barre, he was repeatedly passed over for government positions worthy of his stature. Repeatedly, year after year, illiterates were appointed to choice ministerial posts on account of their ethnic connections, while the Harvard Don looked on. If that jackal, this is where Said's humor comes out very clearly, if that jackal that went by the name of Siad Barre had a drop of patriotism in his blood, he'd have appointed Hussein at least ambassador plenipotentiary to the 3 East African countries of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania all at once. With his native Swahili, exceptional learning, and urbane manners, diplomatically he'd have run circles around the bloody Abyssinians, and Somalia might have been spared the fate that was to befall her. He then finishes up, if there was ever a man with grounds for grievance and bitterness, it is Hussein. But he took it all in stride with grace and without bitterness or grudges. And that, ladies and gentlemen, bespeaks character. It is the distinguishing mark of noble substance. But in a sense, this injustice might have been a blessing in disguise. If he had gotten embroiled in the world of politics, he would have been lost to that of Somali education. Where scores of Somali students have learned from his giving nature, he gave much and received little in return. And that, I think, really sums up quite a lot of what we know about Hussein. He was very, very modest. He was very quiet in his ambition for Somalia, for the people he worked with. He always tried to enable other people's learning. I met him when I was a PhD student. I was living in Hargeisa, and he arrived in this sort of whirlwind of energy, and I was sort of taken aback. So who is this person? What is going on? And I later got to know him. I was lucky enough to live in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he lived and for many, many years as he taught at the College of the Holy Cross. And it was always about that, always trying to facilitate people's learning and do so in a very quiet, almost invisible way. So I hope that we can remember that spirit of Hussein Tanzania through the humorous perspective also of Said Samatar, who was himself a giant in the field of Somali studies.
Okay, good. Well, I want to start my brief remarks by thanking the people who have put this event together, particularly Ayan Mahmoud, who is sitting here, and the person who began the project of now well into many years of Somali Week. Ayan is an indefatigable person who I think among her gifts are community outreach and organizing people. So I want to thank her for the opportunity. The chair of this evening's proceedings, Dr. Idil Osman, for taking us through this. And my co-panelists, my friend Laura Hammond, Dr. Hammond, and my brother Abdi, who is the main attraction really tonight. We'll see if he lives up to that.
You can tell him.
But all of you also who are here tonight, I mean, I see a difference between living now in Hargeisa for the past 2 months and here in London, Somalis. If this was in Hargeisa today, or even in Borama or Harigava or Bur'o,
or Mogadishu.
Or Mogadishu. Well, you can speak on Mogadishu. I can't speak on Mogadishu. But I think rightly so. The energy and the enthusiasm and a sense of young people wanting to be part of any discussion is incredible. I think there will be serious problems of overcrowding this. But this is in many ways the opposite in places like here and in the diaspora community in the United States. There's a vast difference between people who are in the local context and those who are in overseas. But I want to thank those of you who have decided to come tonight and listen to the conversation, and the University College for hosting us. I want to speak about 3 people, not really 2 people. One is Said, who was a good friend, older good friend, then Professor Hussein also. And then I want to speak about someone who really ought to be recognized also, but in a different kind of a league, but an important person in Somali studies and for Somali people, and that is Dr. Omar Ino. For those of you who might not know him, he also died. He died recently. So I want to proceed then in that manner and say a few words about each one of them. Let me start with Professor Sheikh Samatar, not related to us, excellent of name. But I have 5 things I want to say about him quickly, without great deal of elaboration. And the first one, of course, is that, as Laura correctly said, Said was instrumental in the creation of what has now become the International Congress of Somali Studies. And it's the only kind of a institution, even though it doesn't have a place, that brings together those who are interested in Somali studies, whatever discipline they come from. And Said was an important person in that initial conception. It is now, nearly 40 years since this was put into place. So we are grateful for to Said for doing that. The second thing I want to say about Said is that at his better moments, and these were not infrequent, Said typified bursts of Somali poetic power. He was a fine historian with a great deal of imagination, and has enormous knack for retrieving the past. And also Said showed what I called a vibrant restlessness that the first generation scholars, like the 2 of us here and many around the world, are born into a perplexing ephemerality of monochrome yet seductive modern societies. We are on the margins of those as scholars from Somali society, first generation scholars. And there's a certain kind of a restlessness that comes along with being a visitor to the world of scholarship, coming from a society that has no tradition of scholarship, poetic imagination perhaps, but no scholarship. And this seductive modernity in which we are thrust into creates a certain degree, I think, of perplexing existence for first generation Somali scholars. The third thing I want to say about Said is that every time I crossed intellectual swords with him, and these were many, many moments and occasions, he often offered to me what I called unseasonable, not unreasonable, but unseasonable insights into things that I thought are concepts or ideas I thought were all settled now. There was no more conversation to be had. But here comes Said, very unseasonable, and he will offer insights that will really begin to make you wonder again over what you thought were settled issues. I learned a lot from those encounters with Said, but the fourth thing I want to say also is something about his academic work, as well as his public intellectual contributions, which were quite frequent. Said possessed a degree of, I think, uncommon intelligent courage. If you go back now, you will find one of the finest pieces that he has written was about the SNM, the Somali National Movement, and took the arguments to that group in a way that was quite fierce, but courageous and intelligent and respectful. And he delivered his arguments with what I would call sublime, beautiful prose that Said has command over the English language that Somalis really, including myself, could not match that. Elegant writing, particularly when he writes, but also with a degree of oral precision and sophistication. His movement between language, therefore, particularly Somali and English, was exemplar of what many of us continue to aspire to. If you listen to Said in Somali, it was just seductive. And then he moves into English, so with ease, and equally so, and back and forth. And that capacity is something that I think Said had special talent for. Said's approach, the fifth point I want to say, to the living realities of Somali society and how he approached this. And that, of course, always varied the context in which he saw himself. But one of the things that I found memorable about him, that at his what I call bare and unguarded moments, Said, I could sense when I was with him in those moments that he had a sense of a mixture of what I call tender humanity and a degree of stoicism, that he was very stoic in the way he looked at the reality of the Somali society. He was deeply melancholic in many moments over the valuable traits that Somalis had lost, and felt aghast over the frightening magnitude of the current helplessness in the face of the crashing contradictions that faced Somali society. For Professor Said, the Somali person, the interregnum felt uniquely cataclysmic. For Said, the superb historian, however, Somalis were not that exception. They were not the exception. But on the contrary, they were the latest of many societies who came before them to drop to the depths of the abyss of civic derangement. So for him, so what? Somalis are part of that long chain of human beings who find themselves lost in the wilderness of civic derangement. Whether current Somalis and their friends, Professor Said thought many times, would help save what he called the essential elements of a sinking culture beyond the calamity, including, as Said would say, newly conceived repressive tactics towards artistic creativity, public performance, and joy, and transmit them to the future, Said said, was among the greatest contemporary challenge that faced Somali society. Let me say a few words about my friend, Professor Hussein Adam. I wrote about this, by the way, if you go into the Journal of Bildan, you will see some notes about that in 2015. And now, and coming, there's a piece into 2017 issue, which should be out in a month or so. But Hussein Adam was primarily the force, not Saeed, even though Saeed was very instrumental, but Hussein was the force behind the creation of the International Congress of Somali Studies. There were others who, Charles Kashekter and Lee Kasanelli and many others who were part of this. But the driving force behind the conception of Somali studies and the maintenance of Somali studies over the years was Hussein, almost 40 years. The next Congress of Somali Studies will be held in his honor in Hargeisa, the capital of Somaliland, and the director of that project is here tonight, Dr. Jama, Musa Jama. So if you can master some resources and you are interested in this, Hargeisa would be the appointed place for that, to honor Hussein and to have the Congress there. We're looking forward to this. The second thing I want to say about Professor Hussein is that he, as Laura said, co-edited, even in his last years. I remember visiting him, and you can see that time was short. But even then, he saw to it that the proceedings of the International Congress of Somali Studies was published for preservation as well as for wider circulation. And a good specimen, as Laura said, is that large volume, Mending Ribs in the Sky, Oceans for Somali Communities in the 21st Century. Professor Hussein was also a man of ideas, with a marvelous and productive mind, urbane, multicultural in his upbringing, very unlike many Somalis, very urbane. And he earned, as Laura, my friend, said, rare opportunities to study at two of the most prestigious universities in the world, not just in the United States, that's Princeton and Harvard University. Hussein was also very helpful to upcoming young scholars who are at that age were mischievous, including the two of us sitting here. And I will always remember with great fondness and gratitude of the summer of 1986. We were both junior young assistant professors, and Professor Hussein introduced us with civilized kindness, my brother and I, to present one of our earliest joint articles to a full hall at the University of Rome, where the International Congress was being held. Hussein's exemplary kindness also but includes serious intellectual interest in the world of ideas. Final word on Dr. Umar Aino. Umar, marvelous human being, came to scholarship a bit late, and the academic will a bit late. He had another life before that. But he will be best remembered, I think, at least from my point of view, for his awakening passion and intelligent defense of the long suppressed equal rights of a very significant and highly productive portion of the Somali people. Secondly, Dr. Umar Aino was a pioneering advocate of the human rights of the Jarer Somalis, or what he later will call Bantu Somalis, and many of us were privileged to watch him in action as he courageously and with poignant bluntness battled against ossified and indefensible Somali pretensions of ethnicity superiority, still prevalent. Instead, Dr. Umar offered to the audience around the world versions of the Jarers or the Bantu Somalis deeply shadowed condition, one which to this day is of pervasive othering, exclusion, and exploitation. I think the Somali people need him now more than ever. Let me conclude then with this final thought for all three of them. For those of us who want to remember what Professor Sheikh Samatar, Professor Hussein Adam, and Dr. Umar Aino mean for us in posterity, we might find these lines from the distinguished American poet Marianne Moore worth sharing. Marianne Moore, the great poet, says, quote, "Life is energy. and energy is creativity. And even when individuals pass on, the energy is retained in the works of art or scholarship, locked in it, and waiting release if only someone will take the time and the care to unlock. Thank you very much.
Final word it is. First, I would like to thank Ayan and her team for inviting this renegade northern Somali into the arena that she managed. I'm exceptionally grateful for the work you have done on this for over a decade. And it behoves Somalis to heed not her advice, but her actions, that commitment and perseverance delivers.
Yeah.
So, despite the disagreements you and I will have, despite the disagreements I will have with my brother, I think the lesson that your work models is that we can have disagreements and still be brothers and sisters. So thank you for doing the work you have done. Remembering these Somali giants is a sad event, but also a celebratory one. It's sad today because the man who brought Hussein, Dr. Hussain Adam, Professor Hussein Adam, to Somalia, General Mohammed Abshir Musa, passed away yesterday. So I just found out this morning as I landed Heathrow a note saying that General Abshir is gone. I had a conversation with General Abshir in my office in Minnesota about 2006, 2005, I'm not too sure what the date was. And he narrated how he brought Hussein. He met him in Princeton because General Abshir was doing a year of training as a commander of the Somali police force at Princeton. And that's where he met Hussein. And who knows what might have become of Dr. Tanzania if Mohammed Abshir never met him in Princeton. So fate has it that we are celebrating the work of Hussein and Saeed and others just at the same day that the man who was responsible for bringing his wonderful talent to Somalia has gone today as well. So pray for General Abshir as well. Just want to say a few things about Hussein. I did not know Hussein as well as Ahmed did, or as well as Laura did. I had few encounters with him, and the first one was at the Somali National Academy when I was a PhD student, and he was a huge man in the Somali academic world. So another Somali person was managing the institute, and I didn't know that gentleman, so I ran into Hussein in a party, or reception in Mogadishu. So I hesitantly approached him as a sort of a timid graduate student if I could meet with him and that he could help me meet some of the people who are important for my work in the city. And he was incredibly generous, although he didn't know me at all. Hussein went to the best schools, as Ahmed and Laura has said. But what's marvelous about this is this gentleman could have had whatever job he wanted in the United States or anywhere else in the world. Through General Abshir and whatnot, he decided to go home, quote unquote. He was born in Tanzania, but Hargeisa and Mogadishu beckoned for him because of the memory of his parents and the stories that he heard about that country. Unlike the rest of us, what I call the luminaries, Ahmed Samatar and myself, and Idil, of course, coming on board recently, who have decided to stay in the comforts of North America and Europe. Hussein went home to serve at a time that was a tough time to be in Somalia, as Laura, paraphrasing Saeed Samatar, said. And so we owe him a great deal of gratitude for being a pioneer, not only as an academic and as a scholar, but as a person who served his people when they needed the most, and when many of those who were in positions of authority did not appreciate the talents that he could bring to the table. The political system, as Saeed noted, betrayed him. And I hope someday, whatever becomes of that country, whether we are 5 countries or 2 countries or 10 countries, people will remember Hussein as a pioneer. Even if we are not in the same political field, we are the same people. And that's what he stood for. Hussein and I oftentimes had disagreements at the African Studies Association over the previous 15 years as the country collapsed and thereafter. And I was a young militant, pan-Somali, sort of a Somali republic, much like this old guy was before he became a renegade. And we will see that later on tonight after we leave these celebrations. But Hussein, I will tease him, I will harass him, I will harangue him, but he always responded with a smile. And that's the genteel person he was. Saeed and I never met many times. We had our first occasion at the African Studies Association meeting in Baltimore. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was in 1992-93. I knew about his work because I used it when I was a graduate student. And for me, the best book Saeed wrote, in addition to the one that Laura talked about, is Oral Poetry and Somali Nationalism. That, for me, is a masterpiece. And every person who's interested in that country should read it and buy it. It still can be purchased. And so Saeed and I met in the corridors of the meeting. And there was another gentleman from Toronto, I think at that point in time, another Somali poet who was quite colorful in his sort of behaviors and his language and whatnot, and I will not mention the name. So Saeed was incredibly sort of protective of that man, although he didn't need much protection. And so I took on this gentleman. And Saeed stood back and he said, Abdi, you are too young to harass us. And I said, and you are too old to be overbearing, I told him. And the conversation went on. But despite the very strong intellectual disagreements I had with Saeed Samatar, what I found him is an incredible ability to be not only forgiving, but to be also welcoming the kind of arguments that would have made many other people quite uncomfortable. That's the marks of a scholar, in my opinion. Both Saeed and Hussein, Professor Samatar and Professor Adam, Tanzania, got into the academy, as Ahmed said, when there were no others. Saeed's book was the first academic written by a Somali for me as an undergraduate, as a graduate student, a master's student I was at the time. So without Saeed, I would not be here. Without Hussein, I would not be here. And so for the young men and women, it's very important to understand the kind of work those folks have done and the difficulties they had into breaking into the Western academy as Somalis. I mean, the gentleman who was the first Somali PhD, I think is still alive, Hassan Ali Mira in Columbus, Ohio, I think. So they are precious people, and I think rather than being about ourselves and about the next Twitter tweet that our president is so good at, I think it's important to dig in. Well, Ahmed's president, not my president. Finally, let me say a couple of things about Umar, Dr. Umar Eno. Umar and I were good friends. I actually knew his brother before I knew Umar Mohammed, who works in the Middle East. And Umar and I served together on a committee called the Harmonization Committee in Nairobi in 2003 and 4, late 2003. And so Umar told me, you are Farader, he said. He is the sort of the non-Bantu Somalis. So I said, Umar, I have as kinky a hair as you have, so you cannot tell me that I'm not one of you. But he said, you folks from the north, he said, and anybody north of Mogadishu was a northerner for Umar, which I found very sort of interesting as a geographer, so the north. But he said, you barely ever study people in the south. And I said, is Beledweyne part of the south? And he said, not quite. God bless him. And so I said, well, Umar, I'm really sorry to blow sort of your cover. I don't see any Southerners who are studying northern Somalia. Tell me one. And there was none. And I said, but I have a surprise for you. I spent a year in Golwayn on the Shabelle River and several months in Jowhar. And in both of those places, the folks you are talking about as the other Somalis were the folks who were central to my fieldwork, because I was studying child labor at that point in time in the plantations of Golwayn and Jannale and other places. So I said, now I invite you to come to the north and study the northern, since I have studied, quote unquote, your people. Umar, I think Ahmed summed it quite well, and I won't add anything to that. He challenged Somali orthodoxy, plain and simple. Made me uncomfortable as sort of the other Somali from his vantage point. But he and a whole group of southern Somalis generated a new narrative in Somali studies that we should take very seriously. And the last time I met Umar was in Tennessee. He organized a conference about Somali minorities. So I said, Umar, I'm not a Somali minority in your lexicon, so why am I here? So he said, to embellish us, he said. And so I said, I'm really sorry, but you come from Mogadishu, Umar, and you had better opportunities than northerners like me, who grew up in remote corners of the northwest of the country. So I think you have given up on your minority status when you went to schools in Mogadishu, which I didn't have access to. So I am the minority now. But he's the kind of a person that you can engage intellectually in such a manner that you can actually be quite piercing, but nonetheless kind and generous. So pay attention to the narrative that Umar and his likes generated in this. And we expect another generation of Somalis, Idil and company, to chart a different course, because we have too few Somali ladies who are in the academy. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. So we're going to move the discussion on to Somali political leadership now. And what we're going to do is we'll begin with Abdi, who's briefly going to talk about his book, the book on the Africa's First Democrats. So we're going to have about 20 minutes of that. And then Laura and Ahmed are going to respond to those discussions, as well as further engaging with the question of Somali political leadership. So we'll invite you again.
I'm going to stand up.
Yeah.
What compelled me to write this book? I think two things did, or two reasons compelled me to write. One is what I consider to be a dearth of existing or democratic regimes that prevailed in the African continent. So it's not a Somali story, it's an African story. Much of the literature on leadership and democracy is relatively thin or quite recent, since the reforms of the 1990s. That's what much of the literature on democracy in Africa writes about. But the 1956, 1957 with Ghana and Sudan becoming independent, until about the 1970s, there was very little about democracy and democratic writing in Africa. And so that dearth compelled me to say, was there any practicing Democrats in the continent of Africa at that point in time? The second reason that compelled me to write is really the desperate need in what I call the Somali Republic. Some of you may disagree what the Somali Republic is, but that's fair enough. I think the nature of bad leadership that has prevailed in that country for the past certainly 30-some odd years forced me to think through and said, is this all that the Somalis can be as political leaders or academic leaders or religious leaders or whatnot? So the desperate need for that compelled me to do this. And the book has two messages, basically. Once, it's a historical recovery for young people who had never known a Somalia that worked and that functioned. Okay? So it's primarily targeted at young Somalis, students in particular, to know that there was a time, and there were Somalis indeed, who practices democracy as good as anyone else, anywhere in the third world. So that's number one. And therefore, to celebrate the two key people who led that project, President Osman and Prime Minister Hussein. And the other one is a warning that if you don't heed, Somalis that is, and other Africans for that matter, if you don't heed the kind of challenges that they confronted and the way they dealt with, then you will remain in the purgatory that you find yourself in today. So it's both a celebration and a clear warning. Very quickly, and I won't go into depth in this, there are two primary books that are quite foundational in the study of democracy in Africa for me when I was looking at this. One is the work of a Professor Carl Rosberg, who was a professor at the University of California when I was a graduate student there, and wrote this book called Personal Rule in Black Africa. It's quite a pioneering work in looking at the kind of leadership that prevailed in Africa in the first 20-some-odd years post-independence. And the second one is one by Marina Ottaway, who worked at the Carnegie Institute Endowment for Peace in Washington, D.C., and wrote a relatively short book called Africa's New Leaders, Democracy or State Reconstruction. And then there are a whole slew of biographies and autobiographies of individuals, but not serious academic ones. Here's what Jackson and Rosberg said. They identified 4 kinds of leaders in Africa, all of them personal leaders, or what you will call, quote unquote, authoritarian leaders. Okay, number 1 is what they call the tyrant. Idi Amin is the moral of that leadership. He is the state, nobody else. It's plain and simple. He's the embodiment of the state, and nobody else has any say whatsoever. Second is an autocrat, which is quite different from Idi Amin and the likes, Houphouët Boigny of Ivory Coast. This is a person who is the top of the gang, and he does not allow his partners to develop an independent base. Okay, so he, again, is a personal ruler, but quite different from the tyrant. And the third is the prince, if you like, Senghor of Senegal, the first Christian to rule a Muslim country, Muslim majority country. Okay, and here this gentleman, or that kind of a leader, honors the arrangements and the agreements he had with those who were in power with him. So he has a certain degree of respect, but nonetheless, he's not a Democrat. And the final is a political prophet in the name of Nkrumah and Nyerere, and I'll have something to say about both of them in relations to Somalia later on. But these are individuals who have a vision for their country, but they think they are the ones who can deliver and nobody else. And so then they are also personal rulers. So Marina Ottaway's work about sort of the new leaders of Africa in the 1990s, she wrote about Uganda's Museveni, Eritrea's Afewerki, Ethiopia's Zenawi, and Kagame of Rwanda. In my book, all of them are personal rulers. For instance, I will suggest that Rwanda's Kagame is a prophet in the form of Nyerere and Nkrumah, okay? While Museveni may be of a different kind. So the argument in the book is that, well, these individuals do not exhaust practicing leadership in Africa during the period they were talking about. So they don't exhaust the history of the continent in terms of political leadership, and that indeed Somalia produced Africa's first post-colonial democracy and democratic leadership, okay, in the form of President Osman and Prime Minister Hussein. Okay, so what's the alternative to personal rule, the individual who runs the country? It's what we call, and a paper Ahmed and I, a chapter Ahmed and I worked on in another book called African State Reconsiderations in the early part of last decade. We identified what we call a democratic statesperson as an alternative to a personal ruler. And here the person is a trustee with an incredible vision for the country. So in that sense, they may be somewhat akin to a prophet, if you like, Nyerere, Nkrumah types. They are also incredibly self-confident. They have not only a confidence in themselves, but they have confidence in their own people. Okay? And so there is a bond between the population and the individual in that sense. Another quality of these individuals is that they have a deep and strong sort of moral code that they are unwilling to, whether it's driven by humanity or it's driven by faith or whatnot, but a deep sort of moral code that bounds them, in my opinion, to be the kind of a leader that Adam, Abdullah Osman, and Hussein were. They are alert, they are not sleepwalking through life and through leadership. They are alert to their circumstances, to the circumstances of their country, and where the country should go. But the defining feature of a democratic statesperson, and here we're talking statesperson, not a statesman, because the boys want to hog it, right? Right? Is their respect and love and commitment to the Constitution that made them the leader themselves. Okay? What most of the literature looks is at in African studies, they look at the leader. Rather, what we have done in this book is to look at the relationship between the leader, the regime, the institutions of government in the public, and how those three first things engender collective belonging that's civic in nature among the population that they govern. Okay, this is what the chapters of the book are. I won't read all of these, 8 chapters. The ones I'm particularly interested in looking at is these 2 first ones, where I looked at the early years of these 2 gentlemen to see what kind of life experiences they have had, okay, that may have guided them later on in life. And then their work with SYL. Here, what's quite different in this instance is that they were not the founders. They were not members of the founding group that established SYL. Unlike Nyerere, who established his party, Kenyatta, who did the same thing. So here they are more akin to Mandela, if you like, who did not establish the ANC, but who joined later on. Okay? And then looking at the 5th and 6th chapter, which looks at post-independence and the way in which they practice that democracy. Okay? And then, of course, the march to dictatorship. And what do we learn from these individuals? So let me give you a very quick history of where Somalia came from. Many of us think about 5 Somalia, Shanta Somalia. Well, there was a time that didn't exist. Okay? And this is what it looked like. This is the land of the Somalis, Somali lands, if you like. And I'm wrapping this on Ahmed, of course. Right? The land of the Somalis, or Somali lands, before colonialism. And they shared the borderlessness. There were no internal borders of British Somaliland or Eritrean Somaliland or Ethiopian Somaliland. There was just one Somali, which I hope is what we are aspiring to be someday. Okay? And they shared this with the rest of Africans. There was no Kenya with the boundaries. There was no Ethiopia with the boundaries. There was no Sudan with the boundaries. Just name any country. Okay, so we were not unique in that regard. This is what became of the Somali land. Okay, 5. British, British, French, Italian, Ethiopian, and the northern province in Kenya. And then there is an effort to undo these boundaries. And this is what they did. At least they removed that line up here, okay, and created one, with the hope that someday maybe these others will come and join. Okay, what were they like very early on when these 2 gentlemen, whose personal histories I'm using to look at the history of leadership and democracy in Somalia? Okay. Both of them became orphans very early, particularly President Aden. By the time he was 2nd year, his mother died, and then very soon his father, who served with Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan in the sort of a war against the British in the north, was maimed by a lion. So he had to fend for himself very, very quickly as a young boy, 3, 4, 5 years of age. Hussein was a bit luckier. His mother died when he was about 8 or 9 years of age, but then his father died when he was 9. And he was a camel boy. Both Adam and Hussein were errand boys. They have to fend for themselves. Yeah, okay. And they faced a great deal of poverty, like many Somalis. Fascism was dominant in the south of what's contemporary Somalia. Both of them had very limited education, 3 years of education for Aden and less for Hussein. And both of them faced Italian fascism sort of a steely face and fist, okay? And both of them were partly beaten, but Hussein was the one who was deeply damaged, okay? And it's true that they learned that resistance to injustice, whether by your own people or by the others, is the order of the day, okay? And then both Hussein met a sort of a teacher of Quranic teacher in Galkayo when he was a kid. And that teacher used to say, he was paraphrasing a book he read, لماذا تأخر المسلمون وتقدم غيرهما? Why did the Muslims fall behind and their ilk has moved forward, comparing the Muslims to the rest of the world? That stuck to Hussein until the last day before he died. While Aden, who had less training in Quran and sort of Islam, was just tenacious by nature. He will debate with this Italian priest for which he became a kitchen boy or a cook. Here's a priest, Catholic priest in the south, okay? And Aden will decide to debate with him and tell him how Islam is superior to your Catholicism. So, and so that the internalization of that faith stayed with them throughout their lives, and it became the bulwark against the lust for being in power all the time. Okay. Kinship is another thing they recognized, was that kinship is social rather than political. Manta wa Hajira for the Somalis, you know, your tribes, right? That's the folks you hang around with. For them, it was a cultural thing. It had nothing to do with politics. Okay, 1940 to 1960, the British take over much of the Somali territory, except French Somaliland. SYL begins to join the bandwagon to advocate for the retention of that unity, if you like, but the United Nations betrayed and handed over Somalia back to the Italians, if you like, or Italian Somaliland. And it's during this period that SNL, another leading political party in the north of the Republic now, or British Somaliland, they joined forces to advocate for the retention of that union. And some of the people who supported SYL were northern Somalis who lived in the United Kingdom. Okay. So the the United Nations betrayed the Somalis, and again, everybody was back to Ethiopian Somaliland, British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, and so on and so on. And the Italians came back in the form of a trusteeship authority in 1950. And it's in 1950, May of 1950, when they began to brutalize Abdurrazak Haji Hussein in Baydaba, where he was the chief postal officer in that town. And it's there his lung was damaged, which is ultimately why he died a few years ago. Okay, so Adam was the ideas man, while Abdurrazak was the political prisoner under the trusteeship. But in the 1950s, you see Aden's hand working in the assembly in Mogadishu, and this is where he began to practice the art of democracy. He wasn't the leader of the party, he wasn't the spokesman of the party, but nonetheless, when there was contention within the party, everybody looked at Aden for ideas. Okay, and it's in the mid-1950s, Hussein met Aden. He was sent to the United Nations, elected to parliament in 1959. So that earlier period was quite foundational for both of these individuals. Here is the Somali diaspora, okay, in New York. Abdurrazak Haji Hussein was sent to New York. This is a gentleman that Somalis ought to be ashamed of themselves for not remembering him. This is Michael Mariano, a Christian Somali who wrote everything SYL wrote when they were fighting against the Italians, returned to Somalia in the 1940s and early 1950s. Okay, they brought him from Hargeisa, okay, with another Somali, half Indian, and these were the two people who wrote all the petitions, Michael Mariano. This is Kathy and her husband, who owned a small sort of a guest house in New York, who basically fed all the Somali delegates who came there because SYL and SLN did not have any money. So you are not the first diaspora to be important. Here's Abdullahi Isa, the first prime minister, and the trusteeship, Abdurrazak Haji Hussein and Sheikh Ali Jamali, another minister. Okay, so 1950s, late 1950s becomes important, and Mogadishu becomes the hub of Somali, the search for Somali unity. Mohammed Ibrahim Igal and his team goes to Mogadishu, Aden comes to Hargeisa, and so on and so forth. And it's at the end of that the British and the Italian Somali leaders decided to unify the two territories when both of them became independent in 1960. That was done. Ethiopia, during all of this period, was intensified its opposition to the unification, and to the point where at the end, or in the late 1959, 1960, Haile Selassie writes to the Soviet Union to see if the Soviet Union could use its veto power to block the new emerging Somalia joining the United Nations as a member state. So it's not nothing new. Here's the First Republic, 1960 to 1964. Jami Abdullahi Ghalib was the first official to be elected in that republic from Berbera as the Speaker of Parliament. Listen to this. Whether it's in Hargeisa or in Garawa or in Mogadishu or in Kismayo, yeah? Every one of the politicians want to be a leader. Elect me, that's their motto. Here's somebody who didn't ask to be elected, and the parliament of the new republic decided to elect him as a provincial president unopposed, and nobody else competed with him. That's a lesson for the young people to remember and to think about. Okay, and he appoints Abdirashid Ali Sharmarke as the prime minister, and he calls him the most qualified person to be in that post. Here's Aden's portrait as a president. Please read this. This is unimportant. This is his first speech to the nation. Okay, I looked at the speeches of Kenyatta, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Nasir, even Mandela, and none of them speak about democracy in the way that he did in 1960. Read it carefully. And at the end he says, to strengthen our democracy, the democracy for our country means that all of us must respect law and order and the laws that we have made for ourselves, and to resolve our controversies in a peaceful and a fraternal manner. Who else said that when they first became president in the continent? Okay? And the guys who have come ever since in Somalia, whether it's Somaliland or Mogadishu, don't speak in these terms. Here's Aden visiting Hargeisa in 1962. Okay? Look at the order of the people. And if you go to Hargeisa or you go to Mogadishu today, it's the exact opposite. It's like a meat market you see in Hargeisa or in Mogadishu or in Garawa. Okay, look at the order, how organized the people are, how respectful they are of one another. Their body language speaks volumes. What did this party, what's this government accomplish, the First Republic as I call it? Number of things, but I will just focus on two things. One is the way they dealt with the 1961 Constitution, and this is a lesson for all of us. Okay, and the way they dealt with the military coup that took place in Hargeisa. In 1961, when the coup took place in Hargeisa, the individuals who acted were brought to court, civil court, not military court. The defense minister wanted to create a military court. Aden said absolutely not. There is no provision for such a court in the constitution of the country. So they were taken to court. The government, by and large, paid the bill of the lawyers who were defending the northerners, who were the coup makers. Yeah. Okay? And in the end, they were let go because the court made that judgment, and the government respected that. The division of responsibilities between the judiciary and the executive, if you like. Okay? And the plebiscite was run quite well. There were two places where the election was rigged. Welawayn, that's where the name comes for the southerners. Yeah? Okay? And of course, Adale. But the two individuals who did that were taken care of. And the two major opposition regions to the constitution were the northwest, Hargeisa as the center, and Beledweyne. And Beledweyne has the highest rejection rate. 61% of the population who voted said no to the constitution. So why Hargeisa and why Beledweyne? You have to read the book. So in 1964, an election takes place, which is said to be the freest and the fairest in Somalia. Here's how the American embassy sort of describes it. Okay, then Aden decided to change course and appoint Abdurrazak Haj Hussein as the prime minister. And this is why. I won't read it, you can read it. Somalia needs a government that has respect for the laws and the constitution and for its honesty. And I think Hussein has these qualities, he says. So the judgment, rather than saying, send me your CV. Now, if you go to Mogadishu, everybody wants to apply for a job as a minister or a prime minister. So you send your CV like a regular bureaucratic job. The mentality in the place was quite different in those days. Okay. Why Abdurrazak? Because Aden observed him as a minister of Interior and Public Works, Minister of Interior when the constitutional plebiscite took place. Okay? And Minister of Public Works, that's when Somali Airlines was formed under his watch, where out of the 27 people who were selected to go and get trained in Germany, 25 of them were Northerners. Okay, not because he favored the Northerners. There was a merit-based exam, and they came to the top because of the English language. He was a Southerner. He didn't oppose that. He said, let's go. Okay, so there's a lesson for all of us here. And then here is how Hussein is described by the American embassy. He's a tough guy, okay? He works very hard. He's relentless, but he's fair. Despite the fact that he lost a lung. And then Muhammad Ibrahim Igal, the principal politician in the north, this is how he describes Abdurrazak Haji Hussein. You can read more. I'm sort of opposed to him, and he has many enemies, but Igal notes here that the Italians also don't like Hussein because he's not corruptible. Okay? Here's Mr. Hussein with the president giving him a list of the sort of cabinet members that he was about to appoint. Can you see a picture of that in Villa Somalia today? Meat market, I tell you. Okay, here's the cabinet. What's the size of the cabinet in Hargeisa? What's the size of the cabinet in Garowe? 70. What's the size of the cabinet in Mogadishu? 12 men. Sorry, ladies, 12 men. Okay? They are coming. Okay. But please think about it. Take note of this. This is a picture that's worth 1,000 words, in my opinion. Okay? And those 12 men did not apply for the job. They were selected because people knew their work before they became ministers. Now, if you go to Mogadishu, there will be no space for them to stand, 70 of them. Okay, here's the lineup of the ministers, and how many of those 12 were Northerners? 5 of them. And those 5 were the principal portfolios. Okay, Foreign Affairs from Gebile, if you like, my hometown. Okay, Defense from Borama. Minister of Information, that's how Ahmed got his job at the BBC, because there was a Northerner who was the minister. Favoritism, right? Okay, Finance. Awil Haj Abdullah. Awil, there's this interesting story. Awil was a Christian. Anthony James, his name was. The day after the election, his mother saw him coming out of the mosque. So she said, my son, what were you doing in the mosque? Is it because of the election? You were just elected. And then so he smiled. So she said, in Somali, she said, Allahu ya'awilu dima badani. Okay. And then Mahmoud Isa Jama, Minister of Agriculture. So regional balance, not because of regional balance. He said these were the most competent people, that is 12 men, if you like. And then here's the rub. At the point of vote of confidence, when Abdurrazak's cabinet was brought to Parliament, and the vote took place, the opposing sides and his supporters were equal in number. And it was one last man who could either sanction the confidence for the government or who will ensure that there is a new election, if you like. And so the man first said in Parliament, said, yes, I vote for him. And then all of a sudden he said, no, I take that back. No. Abdurrazak speaks right in Parliament. If that happened today, there will be war in Parliament in Mogadishu. Okay? And see what he says. Mr. Ali was a pro-Italian during the trusteeship. Then he joined as well, became a minister in the previous government, and then I removed him from that post. He has been a yes man all of his life, and his chance to say no today was betrayed by his yes habit. Since my government's fate depends on his vote, I want the president of the chamber to count Ali's vote as negative so he could be liberated today. And the government fell. Can you imagine Hassan Khaireh saying that today? No. Can you imagine somebody in Kismaya saying that, or in Garawa, or in Hargeisa? No. This was a different breed of Somalis, and they left a lesson for us to learn. So 4 things this government accomplished, but I won't go through all of them. I'm going to pay attention to the civil service and the anti-corruption drive. The civil service were examined, the entire civil service, and then once it was by an independent commission decided who was competent and who was incompetent, the firing began to take place by Abdi Hussain. In the Italian, they used to call it posta rossa, okay? And so this is parliamentarians speaking about this, and they said, he's a tough man, but nobody said he used tribalism or he used corruption or any other standards to select the people who were fired. Among those who were released from his job was his own brother, who was a male person, Biantoni, if you like. Okay? And they said he's the first prime minister to have any courage of that kind. None of the folks who are running the country, wherever they are, have that kind of a courage any longer. And Duhul, who was the owner and the publisher of a journal called Dalka magazine, the most critical newspaper the country ever saw, that was privately owned, not the stuff that they are printing today. And this is what he had to say when Abdi began to fire ministers because they were corrupt. So not only did he clean up the civil service, he warned his ministers that nobody is above the law, as Adam said when he was elected. Okay, read this, please. I won't read it. So give you this 30 seconds to read. As a conclusion, let me go through quickly. Here's Adam visiting the pilots who were in training in Germany that Abdi Hussain helped recruit. Look at how neatly dressed those young men are. Okay. And now when you see these days, it's a shovel, I tell you. Okay. Adam speaks in 1964 when he realized that the parliamentarians were corrupt. Many of them were corrupt, not all of them, not a majority of them, but enough of them were corrupt. And he said the only way to clean up the system is for those who are serious about the job to say no to the parliamentarians and not to accept their corrupt behavior and methods. Okay? Although he knew that 3 years down the pike, they will be the ones who will either renew his mandate for a second term or fire him. But he had the courage to say that. And then 6 months before, then, he speaks, 6 months before the election, parliamentarians voted to give themselves a golden handshake if they were not elected again. Okay? 24,000 shillings, which was a lot of money in those days. And they assumed Adam will not have the courage to confront them and say no, because he needed their votes to become a second-term president. He says, read that, please. Those who delude themselves that I will not have the courage to ask for discussion, rediscussion, which means a veto and a deliberation because of the upcoming presidential election, but they are making a big mistake if they think of me that way. And he vetoes it. And then, of course, they didn't elect him a few months later. But he had the courage. And then one of the last things I want to say in this, now they pay a lot of money to get elected. For my job, I was there, paid a lot of money. The last night he was paying $30,000 per head. I was the head of the commission watching this. Okay? Hassan Sheikh was paying $50,000 a vote. Okay? Abdullahi Hashish from Bur'o, one of the biggest merchants in the country at that point in time, comes to Aden. and tells him, please use my money. I know you are not going to use your own money or the government's money. Use my own money to pay these bloody MPs. And he said, thank you very much for your support, but no, I cannot go that road. If it was Hassan Sheikh or Formaggio, quickly. What did we learn from this? This is the final point. Aden retires from the presidency, but he becomes a permanent member of parliament. Okay? Abdi Razak remains in politics, and her ranking becomes the senior, most important opposition member in parliament. Okay? Until, of course, the military overthrew. One of the last words the president said, just as he walked out of Villa Somalia, as a warning to Abdi Rashid and his team, without democracy, nothing good will happen. They did not heed that advice. And it's because of that, that's why we are where we are today. So, history. What are their contributions then in Africa, to Africa? Oops, sorry. Here's Abdi Razak as he came out of prison, 3.5 years of prison under Siad Barre. He almost became like a Sufi type, right?
Nice hair.
Nice hair, unlike yours and I. We don't have much. Okay. Here's Adam when I visited him in his farm just few years before he passed away. And listen to this. He asked me, where are you from? So I tell him, I'm from Gabila in the north. Oh, yes, I went there when I was president. I was a third grader when you came, and we were the kids who came to welcome you to the village. Bless you, he said. Abdi Qasim, who was acting president at that point in time, the TNG, when I went to see him, he said, you are from Boroma. Samaronki Kawaran. I said, I'm not from Boroma, I'm from Gabile. And he said, Gabile, Jibril Abhorke Kawaran. My maternal people. I said, Somali halka ku nooli way badan tahay. Look at the difference. 90 plus years of age. Never asks a question of that kind. The mentality. Okay? Here's Abdi Razak in a boat just in Minnesota, Stillwater, if you like, up north. Yeah, still looked pretty young. I mean, if you eat too much food and junk food, it shows, as Ahmed, you can see on his skin, right? Right? Thank you.
I was thinking, who's going to be the next Somali democratic statesperson? Statesperson, not statesman. Because I think quite likely that statesperson might actually be a woman. And I'll come back to that. You mentioned various qualities that the democratic statesperson needs to have. Trustee with vision, self-confidence, a strong moral code, wakefulness, and the constitutional rectitude. And then I was thinking about the different kinds of challenges that politicians and people interested in politics, not just politicians in formal politics, are confronting right now, whether they're looking at Mogadishu-based politics or indeed Hargeisa-based politics. Because I think, regardless of where you stand on the question of two states or one state, there are two different conflict trajectories, and they're in two different, very different political places right now. So we can think about that. But that kind of constitutional rectitude is absolutely needed in both kinds of contexts, and which is not just about sticking to what the Constitution says, but it's about sticking to the spirit of what the Constitution intends. And we know that, particularly now, as we've seen federalism take root in Somalia, the kinds of loopholes that exist in the current Constitution mean that you can't stick just to the words on the page. You need to go back to what is the intention, what is the spirit of the Constitution as it was framed, and you can pick that apart as well and ask whose intentionality is actually contained in the Constitution, and maybe we pick that up later. Is it Somali? How much influence is from outside? Those kinds of questions. But but those are really important. And the kinds of challenges from a Mogadishu-based inquiry into politics in Somalia lead, of course, to a whole range of challenges about the future, the nature of the security, a Somali-led security sector, if you like. What will that look like? What is the future of the Federalist project? What ultimate kind of position will federal states have, and what will their relation be to the center? What will happen to the 4.5 formula? We know that Omar Eno was a strong champion. He was here in Somali Week, I think, 4 years ago, when we have this university night. He was one of our featured speakers a few years ago. And he made this point very, very clear that there's a problem with 4.5. There's also a problem with taking it apart in some ways and allowing a kind of will of the majority. In some ways, whatever protection is provided to Somali minorities, even that small amount, as unfair as it is, may disappear. So maybe we could talk about that more in the discussion as well. What will happen to the future of the 30% quota for women as well? When you think about constitutional rectitude, how does that give you any tools for thinking about the future of women in Somali politics? Whether it's in Mogadishu or in the federal states or in Somaliland. So various kinds of relations of kind of relevances to current contemporary issues. But there were a few other points that came out in your analysis that I thought worth kind of underscoring. One was that idea of clan as being a cultural unit rather than a political unit. And that is really interesting and would be worth thinking about what others here in the audience have to say and to think about that. What is the proper and most desirable kind of position of clan? Of course, in the absence of a functioning central state over the last 26 years, one can understand how the clan has come to take on political significance because it was a provider of security and order and protection. But that's not. We know that clan always changes anyway. It's a dynamic feature. So what is its future? The question of Ethiopian independence, or Ethiopian intervention, even at the early stages, on the threshold of independence, that it opposed a unified Somali state, is really an important reminder, and it's something that we could think about in contemporary politics. What is the role now of Ethiopia, and how might that question of constitutional rectitude, if you like, and the Somalis' kind of charting of its own political future be carved out? How much is it able to do that with the big brother or the big neighbor of Ethiopia standing next to it or over it? The questions, the last points you made about both of these characters and their kind of dedication to putting nation before clan, party, ethnicity, to rooting out corruption, to saying no to nepotism, even to the extent of firing one's own brother.
I intend to fire him.
I'm sure. Whichever of you gets into political office first, the other will have to be careful.
I will be.
Really important points, and it again goes back to my original question of what is this democratic? Who will this democratic space person be? It's a really interesting question. And what will that look like? There have been a lot of, I want to come back just at the end of my remark to saying we've had a lot of discussion around important Somali men, and that's fine, that's useful. But I do think that especially with so many women here who are emerging, who are taking up, as you say, the kind of joining into both the intellectual, academic kind of community. I've had several women PhDs, Somali women who have graduated from SOAS with PhDs, and working with others. It's really important to bring women into that question about the political future of Somalia and what will that look like, and not have this be about the kind of big men story, but also about the big person story, I think, more broadly for Somali politics. So I just leave it there.
So before we open it up to the floor, I'd like to give the last few
Thank
words
you.
to Ahmed.
Thank you. Well, I want to start my remarks with crossing swords with my colleague Laura, and that is, I am not convinced that gender identity or racial identity, for that matter, or religious identity, is necessary to propel someone to a position of leadership. That women, I'm a feminist in many ways and I support the point, but they have to earn their place in the struggle for social transformation. And I think if the project becomes one of presupposition, I'm a woman, therefore I deserve this, I'm not sure I want to buy that. I want to say, okay, you are a woman and I accept the gender question and that the equality ought to be in place, but what do you got on the table? What do you have to offer the table? And in many times, whether it is racial or religious or gender identity, you end up with incompetent people sitting on the table by the sheer identity of who they are. So I think the question of gender, much like race and others, have to be qualified. Yeah, I have to be qualified. Otherwise, we just rejig the same game, you see, and it doesn't, in the end, advance the historical process. But that there is a degree of inequity that has to be addressed first is certainly well taken. Let me move on quickly to my remarks. I want to say first a few things about Abdi's profile. The author of this book, I think, is important. And I say this not because he's my brother. I cherish that, of course, and he's dear to me. But I want to be as distant from that as much as possible and say something about him as a scholar. And I want to say four things about that quickly. One, I have worked with Abdi for now close to 30 years. And we have done many things together. So I know him intellectually, I think, somewhat intimately. And I can say, therefore, first thing is that he's one of the very few Somalis I have met who really has a very refined mind, and at the same time is no nonsense thinker that doesn't buy the garbage that people put on the table, but can dismiss that rather quickly and move on to what the real issues are. And that takes some intellectual tenacity and courage. The second thing that I find about Abdi's profile is that he has, among the Somalis who are now in the intellectual playing field, perhaps an uncommon scholarly productivity. It's just extraordinary energy to produce work again and again and again, and do it in a way that is quite bath-breaking, much like this book is. The third thing I want to say about Abdi is that he has become a leader of the International African Studies Organization. No Somali has even come close to that, including myself. So envy a great deal of this, but also appreciate that he has become the president of the African Studies Association, which is an elected position among scholars of African studies around the world. And that, I think that's a superb achievement. And then the final thing I want to say is that he has a very generous but strong civic sensibilities that I find quite rare among the Somali people that I have known, whether they are from Somaliland or whether they are from Somalia or in other parts of the Somali territories. That put together, therefore, I say on behalf of my family, our family, I'm very proud that he has taken our name to places that very few have dared to go, and very proud, therefore, of his accomplishments. But the debate begins. And therefore, I want to say first that in 1961, the late Professor I.M. Lewis of the School of Economics and Political Science, the LSE, published a pioneering volume, famous now, called The Pastoral Democracy. This work set what will become in time the dominating paradigm in Somali studies. And that paradigm, full of insights and rich in description, But at the heart of that paradigm, which Lewis has put on the table and then will dominate Somali studies, was the assertion that clan identity and the consequent social political action and behavior was the eternal, and I say this, eternal master key of Somali life. That clan identity and the behavior and actions that come along with that, that was the master key for Somali life. It doesn't matter whether you are thinking about 15th century Somalis or whether you are thinking about 21st century Somalis. That's what he argued. And that this clan identity, therefore, is baked into the psyche and cultural identity of the Somali people. And many people to this day continue to borrow from that thinking. Such thinking very much in line, therefore, with the postulates of British colonial social anthropology taught, among other places, at Oxford University, where he did his graduate work. And that kind of a perspective then began to slowly trigger a fierce debate in Somali studies that has been raging nearly now for the past 30 or so years. I say this because the main counter thrust to this dominant paradigm came in the form of what has been dubbed as, quote, the transformational perspective. Abdi's work, therefore, to ground it in the historical context of the movement of intellectual life in Somali studies, exemplifies this intellectual project that challenges this dominant paradigm of clan-centered society. And this approach, therefore, treats clan identity, which I share with Abdi on this, as somewhat resilient, there's no denial of that, but at the same time, what I would call fugitive kind of item. Fugitive in the sense that it disappears, comes back, disappears. So the question then becomes, why is it fugitive rather than resilience? The second thing I want to say here is that instead, therefore, the transformationist perspective that Abdi has been part of the leaders of this scholarly work attempts to delineate the complexity of what Robert Cox, the great political economist and historian, has usefully called, quote, historical structures. The historical structure of that particular period in which one is discussing a phenomenon. What does that then mean? Historical structures means, among other things, it includes the delineation of the prevailing ideas of the time. What are the ideas that dominate people's thinking at that given time, whether it is here in Britain or whether it is in the Somali territories? Ideas. Institutions, which is really the construction of the practices of the society through time, institutions. And the nature and the struggle over material life, which for me, coming from a kind of a neo-Marxian perspective, in many ways is a driver of the historical process, the struggle over material life. Here then I think one focuses on the fundamental contradictions that arise from the age under consideration. This time now, late 1940s, 50s and 60s, I think. Professor Abdi's, therefore, new volume, I think, is an essential part of the challenge to the Lewisian school that many still continue to hold on to. Thus, Africa's First Democrats, the title of the book, is a different kind of a penetration into the post-independence Somali society, the state and leadership. So it's about Somali society, it's about the state and the nature of order and governance, and then, of course, leadership. It brings, therefore, forth that relentless struggle from the onset at the dawn of independence in 1960, contrary to Lewis, to the present time, two factions of the Somali petty bourgeoisie locked in a deadly struggle, unlike tribes fighting over identity. On one side of this story, which continues to this day, are the modernizing and ethical constitutionalists that we have just heard their story being told to us. You can find the same story, by the way, in Hargeisa. I'm temporarily living in Hargeisa, and politics is boiling up there, and you can see it. So it is common. On one side of this struggle, deadly struggle between these two factions of the Bati bourgeoisie, are the modernizing ethical constitutionalists. Example in the north, for example, would be a young, well, not young anymore, he's about my age, but probably, it's an old man now. But he is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Somaliland. Dr. Saad, ethical, constitutionalist in many ways. But on the other side, those we haven't heard much about because the story is being told about these two individuals, are who are also perhaps larger in numbers usually when the contest is at play, but who see civic commons, the state, the national property and the state, civic commons, as an advertising target for personal looting. And not only a personal looting, but a tribalist privilege. This is one of the reasons why I decided to get out of Mogadishu and not come back to it, because I saw this as the fulcrum of conversation and politics in Mogadishu and the South. Abdi's volume then has succeeded, I think, in decomposing modern Somali political history and also declassifying it. Lots of things that were under the table, under the veil, and now these are brought out into the foreground, and the floodlights are on them. That's what I mean by declassifying Somali history. The nutshell then, I think, and the net result include this. The present generation of Somalis, wherever they are in the world, and those who come after them, would need historic individuals to inspire them. And on the contrary, they would need to avoid the example of the second category of the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie I have talked about. This is what I think the great Cambridge Africanist historian John Onsted will call usable past. Usable, the retrieval of usable past. To conclude then, this is, I think, a precious intellectual and civic gift to Somalis who read in a time of degenerative despair. But two questions then arise, I think, out of this volume, which I think have to be part of the discussion tonight. Question number one is, despite the enormous reputation of Abdulrazak Hussain and Aden Abdullah Osman, and I revere both of them greatly, question arises about Aden, such a noble and intelligent and patriot. Did it ever occur to him as a president when he was appointing Prime Minister Abdurrashid, and then had an opportunity to change that and appoint the second Prime Minister? Why did not ever occur to him to say, look, this union is made of two territories, Somaliland and Somalia. I think it's only fair we look for another one to become Prime Minister of the country. If not the first time, why not the second time? This is what pushed me to bring forth the concept of duopoly in Somali politics. And duopoly in the sense that there are two communities that essentially hand over the game to each other. And they have been doing that from 1960 to the present, if you are still interested in Somali Republic politics to this day. Why didn't Aden see this early on and say, look, if we want to hold this country together, we need to find out whether there is someone from British Somaliland who can take up the prime ministership. If not in 1960, then at least in 1964. Abdi might want to respond to that. The second question that arises for me out of this volume, and the last point I want to make, is who are those who will take the mantle that Aden and Abdulrazak have left? Why is it that there is nobody? You see? If there is nobody, then Aden and Abdulrazak become wonderful museum pieces. We go to the Museum of History and we look at that and marvel at that. But they are dead. Not only physically, everybody will die physically, but they die as leaders too. As an example, if there is nobody to revive that kind of election. So the question then is, why is there nobody anywhere among the Somali people of the old republic who can take that mantle? I have wondered about that question and I have no answer for it. But Abdi might be able to do so. Thank you very much.
Second thing to say about what Laura suggested about the 4.5, the bonus. Some people who were not included in the politics in the past are now included. And so should we throw the baby with the bathwater? I think 4.5 is insane, period. It's insane, okay? I understand that the communities that are called minorities were only Somalis. The majority of the population, I worked in the Shabelle River when I was doing my studies on bananas, just before the collapse. The most densely populated part of the country is that region. And if they ever count us in the form of tribes, those called landaris will be langars, I tell you. So imika abaar hala dhigto. Dad inaga badan baa jira oo Soomaaliya xaqna wadanka ku leh. So given that, the folks who have come on top in the so-called 0.5 community are criminals as well. So it gives no service to the ordinary so-called 0.5 people, Somali Bantus. They screw them royally. Let me put it bluntly. So it's no bonus. We have to find a different formula, the kind of formula that Adam and Hussein dealt with. Final thing about duopoly. Duopoly exists in multiple places. I respect the notion, and it's a brilliant idea. Duopoly exists in the south. Duopoly or monopoly exists in the north. We can debate that. But why did Aden not appoint a northern prime minister? Remember, yes, I agree, there were two colonies before the Somali lands became 5. And there were political parties. Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, the leading northern Somali politician, when they went to Mogadishu in 1960, the northern members of parliament, 33 of them had a meeting in Afgoye. It's reported to me by somebody who was present in that meeting. Okay? Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, the other 32 said, where have you been? We couldn't find you. What's happening to our group as members of the new union? He got pissed off and left them. And then they split into 2. A group that began to deal with Abdi Rashid Ali Sharmarka as the new prime minister, and a group that followed Mohammed Ibrahim Igal and became opposed. So if the unions, if the northerns were unified, they could have had something on the table, which they didn't. My people didn't do that. So I can't blame others for that not happening. The second thing is, this was about political parties. The most prominent person from the north was Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, no doubt about it. I'm writing a piece now showing that the reason why the Borama Conference in 1993 succeeded and stabilized and defanged SNM was none other because Mohammed Ibrahim Igal was there. There's a lot of baloney that has been written about tribal meetings, elders, all of this. I was in that meeting in Borama. If it wasn't for Igal, it would have fallen apart because he was a master politician. Okay? But he was not a member of SYL. And this was party-based democracy. Okay? When he comes to Aden, and he wants to run for Speaker of Parliament in 1965, I think it was, 66. And Igal told him, I want to switch parties to run. Aden told him, it's not honorable just to switch parties in order to join. And he ran on his own. He got 43 votes. Sheikh Mukhtar, who became a speaker from Baidawa, or actually not in Baidawa, but that region, won the election. Mohammed Ibrahim Igal, and it's in the book, comes to Aden, and he thanked Aden for advising him, and he said this was a free and fair election in Parliament. So Aden made one remark in that note. Parliamentarians from the south wanted to increase the size of parliament before the next election. And Aden said, unless there is a census in the country, we are not going to do that. And if any group is going to get more MPs under your direction, it has to be for the north. So that democratic project led to Igal being clever enough and shrewd enough politician to work the system such that he became the executive prime minister of the country, not under Adam, but under Abdi Ali Sharmark. If that kind of democracy was worked, and the Northerners were willing to work together as a unit, I have absolutely no doubt that they would have become president and prime ministers again and again and again. But there was no political unit called the North in Mogadishu among the parliamentarians. Everybody was on his own.
Just like now.
Just like now. Thank you. Who will carry the torch? The young ladies and the young men, not of the diaspora. No. Forget it. Ahmed said if this meeting was held in Kismayo or in Mogadishu or in Hargeisa or in Arigavo or in Beledweyne or in Borama, this room will be overflowing. There is a passion and hunger for knowledge. And the young men and women I meet in Kismayo last August, the folks I met in Garawa, the folks I met in Mogadishu, I haven't been up north because I'm afraid that this new politician might put me in prison.
Yeah, you're not welcome there.
Okay. Okay. But the level of hunger, I am not from Mogadishu. I am not from Kismayo. I am not from Garawa. Let me tell you a story about Garawa and then I'll shut down. Okay? When I was there a couple of years ago in 2015, few folks from the diaspora of Puntland will write me emails. Way عايجري no? waxa la oran jiray daaroodku ka soo horjeeda ma jeertaanku necab yahay ayaa la oran jiray. So I went in their midst. About 700 to 800 students came to Garawa with all of the bigwigs. So I said, I am here now alone. Come and get me now. And I gave it to them. And we had a debate. What I saw in these young men and women were people who genuinely cared about their people and who wanted to make a change. Not because they were from Garawa, but because they belonged to that community. I think you can't find that in Hargeisa, you can't find that in Kismayo, but it's going to be in the country, not in the diaspora. Those are the people who want to carry. And therefore the responsibility Ahmed and I and Idil among others have, who are older generation, upcoming new ones.
I've crossed over to the older generation now.
We have to leave something behind for them, to read, to think about. That's our responsibility. And then the challenge is them, would they be flunkies or would they carry the torch?
Professor Abdi, and I'm from Djibouti, and I've realized in your map when you said prior to colonialism, this is the map of Somalia, you included 80% of Djibouti, which is Anfar, which is not Somali, in your map. Is that a discrepancy to the fact? And the second question is Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso, Haute Volta before he became Burkina Faso, where does he fit, although he was a military, where does he fit in your leaderships? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You're calling me young lady. I'm older than you, but yeah. Good to see you. Good to see all the panel, and it's an honor to meet the brothers that I've read about so much. My question is, as somebody who grew up in Somalia when it was really good Somalia, who both their parents come from both ends of the country, and I mean Somaliland and far in a place called Bakol, which you haven't mentioned, and we've got a president called Mukhtar Sheikh Mohammed, who was president for few. As far as I can remember, as my childhood, I always been in between a bridge builder, where one end, when I'm with my Somaliland families, if they say something about the accent of some southerners or whatever, the way of life, I used to say, I wonder if they would say the same thing on you, and that will really stop them to think, it's okay to be different. My question is human level, really, not politician. I'm not political. I'm not interested. I'm not even academic world. But I'm a civic society, and I lead organization that employ almost now 18 people in the third sector. How can we embrace our differences in human level? You've talked about some people today who really had unique way of bringing people together, a unique way of building society. How can we, as human beings, Somalis, from wherever we come from, accept who we are? Therefore, agree the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. I want to first of all thank the panel, and although I missed the presentation, I think I got the gist of it, and I promise you I'll buy the book after this session. Okay. My question is obviously I want to run away from this intellectual kind of a semantic debate of pastoral democracy and primordial and transformation things that Ahmed has touched. But in your book, African First Democracy, I think we all know democracy is a very contested notion. It's not an easy concept to digest. And I want to know what your definition of African democracy is, pastoral democracy of I.M. Lewis and others and so on and so forth. Africa is there's a notion of the strong man who goes into election and then wins votes, but those cannot be described as a democratic individuals. There's no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of worship, there's no freedom of anything, but they are. By definition of the notion of democracy, they are democratic because they're winning votes. That happens in Zimbabwe, for instance, where you have Robert Mugabe who wins election every 4 or 5 years. I can go on and on in Africa. So what is? Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. I do apologize. Yeah, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself again. But please enlighten me. What is your definition of democracy in Africa? How would you say that the African leaders now? How can they be a democratic so that we can call them the democratic leaders?
I mean, do you think democracy, as in the West, as we know it, the concept of it, might not be the right solution for us? We might need someone like Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who's quite strong and takes the country forward. For the main reason is that the people might not be educated enough to decide and to know the right candidate. And we might not have strong, independent institutions to support that.
Okay. So is there... well, thank you all. Djibouti. The map I used is based on not ethnic in terms of Somali, Afar, Somali, Oromo, or whatnot. It's based on what used to be called French Somaliland. We can disagree over the way in which the French did that naming, so absolutely. But there is no intention on my part to use that to silence the significant proportion of the population in Djibouti who are not ethnic Somali, but who are Afars or Danakils. Absolutely not in this. But the way the base maps are created were based on those treaties. And the French took over that, and it became a French colony, therefore. So that's the first part. But I think it will behove the Djibouti politicians and the president, for that matter, to be even more sensitive than others have been, because the people who are called the Afars, who are Djibouti citizens, but who are also Eritreans, who are also sort of Ethiopians, made a stand against the French in the war of liberation. If you go to the United Nations documents, through the process which Djibouti ultimately became independent, they were significant players. So there's no attempt on my part to whitewash that, but it's based on base maps that were used. Second thing about Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara was a military man. Make no mistake about that. Maybe an enlightened military man, but he will be one of the personal rulers that Karl Rosberg and company, in fact, articulated. How to embrace our differences. I think that I will connect that question to the question of democracy here. Let me define what democracy means to me. Ahmed is the political scientist. I'm a geographer, but I dabble in political economy a bit. Democracy, as I know it, is a country or a place where citizens make the decision regarding the rules that's going to govern them. If you look at the statement Aden was making up front in his first inaugural presentation, that's what he said. Qawaaniintaynu inaku isku dhignay cid ka sarraysaa ma jirto. Somalis are more literate today than they were 60 years ago. But they were wiser then than they are today. And so the fact that one is Western educated or schooled makes no difference. Here's what I will say to this. If God gave you some degree of wisdom and then you went to school, the school may sharpen that wisdom. But if you had a brickhead to start with, the brickhead will get sharper and you'll become a sharp idiot, so to speak. Okay? So Western education or education does not give you a wisdom to how to use that. So democracy is the system where the citizens, and therefore the idea of citizenship matters, make the rules that's going to govern them. It's a contested concept. That's the nature. Citizens are not all alike. Ahmed and I, as brothers coming from the same father and mother, disagree on certain things, contestations. But we don't fight. We don't insult each other. We don't kill one another. We live with our differences and therefore embrace our differences, just like you said yourself. Finally, Paul Kagame. Do we need somebody like Paul Kagame? I wrote another book on Botswana. In the meantime. Let me finish. It's called An African Miracle. Okay? Hama, the former president of Botswana, his son is now the president after two others have been presidents. And Maseri, supposedly from two different clans, if you like, had the same project, much like Aden and Abdi had the same project. They came to power in 1966 after the British left. And the British wrote a report there called the Porter Report. It's the final report the British colonial authority wrote on Botswana land. And in there they say, nothing happens here and will never happen. It's a wasteland. Bantustan of apartheid. Botswana today has $10 billion in foreign reserves, the largest import cover anywhere in the third world, including Singapore. It has run democracy, dominated by one party, but many of the municipalities are run by the opposition. The opposition oftentimes garner up to 45%. Okay? The University of Botswana's library is as well stocked as Ahmed's library at Macalester College, a privileged private school in America. Where does that money come from? The government puts that money, diamonds they preserved. $10 billion doesn't go to the president, it belongs to the people of Botswana. Okay? So there are a variety of ways you can get to development. Okay? Some people who are critical of Kagame, I don't necessarily empathize with those critics. Okay? Nor do I empathize with him in saying, Kagame saying, I am the only man who can deliver this. Okay? There comes a point when you have to pass the baton. Adam could have done that. So my question here is, I think Lewis had a point, as much as I would hate to admit. Pastoral democracy. People came together to talk. not to impose on one another. Reach a consensus and move on. Maybe we need to speed up because Somalis take for too long time to discuss things before they decide anything. Okay? So democracy was in our blood. The tragedy is that Lewis was writing about pastoral democracy at the tail end of the colonial empire. What he should have done is to say pastoral democracy under colonial rule. But he ossified, as Ahmed said, he fossilized that as if it was there before and it's going to be there forever. So I think Kagame has a role to play. People like Kagame had a role to play, unlike, for instance, Museveni. I'll take Kagame any time. But I think the idea of democracy and the citizens writing the rules that will govern them is absolutely central. It's not an African thing, it's not a European thing, it's a human thing.
Can I add a few words?
Yeah, of course.
Good. This is good discussion. One word about Aden and his appointment of Abdi Rashid and Abdi Razak, and Abdi's point about the division within the northern contingent in Mogadishu. I agree with that division, and therefore the lack of collective will to do this. But I think that takes Aden easily off the hook. And here's why. You know, Aden should not depend whether the northern politicians in Mogadishu were disunited or not. If Aden is the Aden Abdi is telling us, and I buy the general argument, then Aden should see the general interest rather than, well, because these folks are divided, therefore they are not coming. He should stand up on the mountain and say, look, this is the country we are. These are two nations, communities that have come together. I want to appoint so and so, unless there was nobody of caliber among the Northerners, which could very well be the case. But Aden should have done that, and not the justification should not be, well, because the Northerners were divided, therefore Aden could not do it. He should have done that as he dared to do with Abdi Razak. He gave a Majerten guy to become prime minister in 1960. Good. And then he repeats another one. That's bold. He could have been bold the other way and do the same thing. That's the point I am making, not necessarily dismissing the argument that the Northerners were divided. The second thing I want to say about democracy is, let me tell you something that many of you might just have seen it on TV or maybe a figment here and there, but I was in Hargeisa barely a week ago. And there took place a democratic process that has never taken in the history of the Somali people, period. Not in the history of the Somali people as in terms of politics, modern politics. And that is a fierce debate among three candidates who are competing for the presidency of Somaliland. I helped set up some of the questions. I helped design some of this with the young people who really were the creators of this. There were nearly 5,000 people in this big hall in the hotel, silence, and they stood up there from almost 8:30 until 12:30, with one break. And it was just incredible. I have never seen anything like that, and I have never heard anything like that among the Somalis in the history of these communities. That's democracy, I think, at least one particular version, democracy at play, okay? My argument, therefore, is that Somaliland people, I think, are much more closer to a project of democratic politics than it is in the South. And I say that as someone who went to Mogadishu. We created a party. Abdi was really the engine behind this, Hilqaran. But we saw that, nothing can grow there that's democratic that I can see now. Maybe sometime in the soil will change in the future. But here in Hargeisa, and I have been to Bur'o, I have been to Arigabo just now, to Las Anod, to the West Coast, and you can see that at the grassroots level that there is real democratic politics. Yeah, even when the politicians spice that up with tribalistic notions and calls of loyalty. So that's the second thing I want to say. The third thing I want to say quickly is about leadership, individual leader, whether it's a man or a woman. And that is, at least in my own work, and I think something we did together years ago, distinguish between strong leader and a harsh leader, strong state and a harsh state, okay? And I think what is quite visible from the Abdi's volume on this is that Aden was a strong leader. Kagame, I think, is a harsh leader, not as harsh as Mugabe, but Kagame is the one who sends his goons to assassinate, to assassinate his opposition in South Africa. You see, he does that. So I think strong leader, yes. I think Mandela was a strong leader, and he told the ANC when they were looking for venomous retribution against the whites, and he stood in front of them and he said, "Listen, I am your leader. You elected me as a leader. I'm telling you, this country under my watch is not going to descend into some kind of a racial civil war." And he defied them. So strong leader rather than harsh leader. And a strong leader is someone with principles, but who respects also the integrity of the people, argues with them and the constitution. A harsh leader is someone who willy-nilly wants to apply their own kind of idiosyncrasies and weaknesses to push people in a particular direction. One last small item. And that is Western, non-Western, kind of Islamic, non-Islamic, these kinds of ideas. I don't buy those arguments. I think Abdi is exactly right. And that is, there is a lot to learn from Western democracies and societies. There is a lot to avoid from that too. I mean, I'm an American citizen, and the three of us, and we know what's happening to us in the States. But that does not in any way foreclose or disprove that American democracy doesn't work. We had a president who was crooked, almost quite like this guy, only he was smarter. And he was run out of office by the American people and the political system. His name was Richard Nixon. I just began as an undergraduate in 1974 at the University of Wisconsin when this was happening. There is a lot to learn from Western societies, my friends. Western societies have learned a lot from Muslim societies when Muslim societies were at the peak of the global civilization. Okay? The tables have turned now. Therefore, for Africans, for Muslims, for Asians, whatever the group is, we need to think about how to then rejig our energy and create a democratic politics that will partly learn from that, but maybe put democracy at a different level of intensity and glory. That's what we're going to do. But avoid the danger of being told, oh, West, no good. Other things, whatever you want to call them, good. No. That I think is a very wrong way to see it.
Yes. And then...
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank both of you and Professor Laura Hammond for a very engaging and inspiring sharing with us. However, personally speaking, for me, the whole concept of democracy and our concern with it is actually quite concerning. In Somalia, the concept of democracy, to me as a person, feels like a utopia. The issue is, whether it's achieved in Somaliland or it's achieved in Somalia, does it put food on the table? What does it do for the average Somali or Somalilander? We're so occupied with the politics, we're so occupied with who becomes a leader and how he becomes a leader, but we're not spending enough energy or effort in figuring out what that leader is doing for the people. So shouldn't that be our concern? Instead of being concerned with copying other countries and their methods of choosing leaders, conducting a 5,000 viewer debate. What is that doing for the average person living in Hargeisa today?
Can we respond to that?
Of course, yes. Sure. But I'll be right done. But we can talk about that point. But the second point.
Yeah, right.
For the everyday person.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
The second, I'm sorry, the issue of Somali women. I've sensed that both of you felt some sort of prejudice against Somali women in our participation in Somali politics. But the reality of the matter is we are really discriminated against. whether we would like to voice our concerns or whether we would like to be taken seriously. We do bring something to the table. However, how many chances do we get in the reality of things? Culturally speaking or politically speaking. So thank you.
I feel like Drake right now, so I'll just get to my question. Abdi Samatar, fantastic book that you just published. However, I'm slightly disappointed in you not mentioning Muhammad Haji Ibrahim Magal. Now, I'm not being regionalist or whatever, but the legacy that he lived should be acknowledged. Remember, he was the second youngest head of state, post-colonial, to be elected as a president and to democratically hand over power to the South. He was imprisoned twice, but yet he still pursued unification with the then Somali Republic, and also the legacy that he lived, which is now Somaliland, where he established the foundations what we're experiencing now in Somaliland as what we are going to experience the next election next month. And that's it. And my second question is, we should really explore southeastern methods of governments, and we should, yes, our society needs democracy, but at the same time we need improvement of living standards, and we should explore ideas such as Deng Xiaoping, who is my ultimate hero, Park Geun-hye, Satya Seong, legendary leaders who transformed their societies under a generation. And we should probably even offer one extreme, which is a social contract to our citizens, especially back home, where our citizens who sacrifice democracy in return will improve their living standards and give them economic prosperity, because that's what I prefer.
Good question. That's a good question.
Final questions. I think the question about democracy and how that brings food to the table for the everyday person, how does that feed into the livelihood? I think that's something that all of us can answer. Because they've got specific questions for you, I think maybe Laura can address that one and Ahmed as well. The question about women being sidelined can go along with that one. Regards to legacy, you've already addressed that in Southeast politics. Perhaps you guys want to have a stab at it? Sure. At the roots, yeah? So Laura, let's start with you.
I think I'm double mic'd here. I don't think I
Yeah, you don't need that one, yes.
No, I just want to come to maybe 2 points. One is about food on the table, for sure. I mean, ideally, I think when we are talking about ideals, so that it's an important thing to recognize that we're sort of, all of us being ambitious in our vision of where Somali society is going. But food on the table has got to be one of the prime kind of motivating factors in whatever political system arises, whether it's democracy, as we have been calling it, or something else. What moves people to participate in politics generally is what's in it for them. What do they get from it? And when you're concerned about food on the table or food wherever on the plate, then that's what should move you. And I think there's not been enough focus on that and part of political leaders we have seen in the last generation to delivering that to people. It's been about how do I keep for myself or for my clan a certain amount of power, which has not then been translated into really concrete evidence of, what does governance do for people in the real world? It provides security, some sense of protection and security, and it should provide your really basic, at least your most basic social, needs for survival: food, shelter, basic education. Those things are human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and they should be at least what government seeks to deliver. And so we need more of that, I would say. The other point I just wanted to come back to, of course, is going to be the gender issue, and I wanted I really welcome the point that you made about the discrimination that exists, because I agree with both Ahmed and Abdi that in an ideal world, it should be about absolutely the most qualified people are the ones who receive power and position and lead. and we see time and time again, not just with gender, but with respect to the so-called 0.5 clans or groups, that doesn't happen because they're not allowed in on the table. That clans don't trust what they say. And I did a 2-year research project with colleagues about women in politics, and repeatedly women said, our clan doesn't trust us, our party doesn't trust us. They say, well, you belong to 2 groups, so how can we be sure that you're going to be a reasonable, loyal representative of our political interests? And that kind of thing has to be disentangled before you can get to the question of the most qualified person leads. And that ties in, I think, as well with a point that other lady made about, you said, I'm not political, I'm not interested in politics, but then you said, I've always been a bridge. That's already a political act. And then you said, I'm from the 3rd sector. I lead an NGO with, what did you say, 18 different employees. Oh, wait, one second, just to say that is political. You are powerful and you have influence.
Everything is political, and that is
absolutely.
Displayed here.
So,
but the point I was trying to make is the human contact.
Yeah.
So once we get over that level, then we can think about how we can lead the country.
So the point being that if we think of politics as just who's in Villa Somalia, or who's in the presidential palace in Hargeisa, or who's in parliament, then we're defining politics too narrowly. Yeah. We need to understand politics as being very broad, being precisely about what you do, which actually brings more food on the table, to be honest, than most of the politicians do. So really, you are a political character, and we hopefully see more of that.
Okay.
We just add,
women address.
I think just 2 points I want to make. Oh, this one too?
Double mic.
Okay. Let me disabuse you of one thing, if I may, tonight. And this has been told to us long, probably over 2,500 years ago. Name was Aristotle. He wrote a book called Politics. And Aristotle says that there are really only 2 kinds of beings that do not need politics. The gods don't need politics because the God creates everything and all that. And animals don't need politics. Well, we are neither animals, I hope not, and we certainly are not gods. So politics is part of the reality of human existence if two people and more want to manage the collective things that they share. So there is no escaping away from that, and everybody therefore is in the game whether they realize it or not. It is a necessity. That's the point I want to make. That's one. Second point, democracy and the relationship of democracy to material existence, the question that young sister have asked. I think she is right in the sense that material existence in the end would have to be a very central part of the collective decision-making process. But here's, I think, where she might miss the point, and that is, I will say to you this proposition tonight, and that is, poor countries are poor because they are governed poorly. We are poor. Somalis have been poor, I mean, particularly now, because Somali society is governed poorly, generally speaking. It is poor societies, it is societies that are poorly governed that in the end are also poor. If they are governed well, the probability is that they will do well. This is the case of Abdi's first book with Khama, governing well. This is the case with the other star in the African galaxy, and that is Mauritius. Yeah, the same thing. Yeah. So, if you get the politics right, you might have a very decent probability of getting the material existence right. If that is screwed up, you can be sure that somewhere along the line, the bottom of the economy will drop too.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't matter how many resources that country has. Absolutely. Right. Okay. We have literally 5 minutes before we're going to get kicked out. So I want you to address the question about roots. Why don't we go back 300 years and see if that works? And then concluding remarks and we'll wrap up.
I'm not going back 3,000 years or 2,000 years ago. the world has changed. If you think humans' history is transhistorical, that's what worked at one time will work again and at different circumstances, I don't know where that has happened anywhere in the world. And so people has to live with the context in which they find themselves. Karl Marx said, he was talking about men create their history, but they don't create it the way they would want to.
And the circumstances, their own choice.
Yeah, they don't. And so the context is different now, so we have to bring our imagination to bear how to rewire the system given the conflicts and the context we find ourselves to be able to navigate forward. So that's the way. But I really want to respond to Ahmed and Aden and what has happened in Hargeisa in the debates. If you may.
You can do that in 2 minutes?
I'll do that in 2 minutes. I don't disagree that, among other things, he engineered the debates. Okay, he worked, as he said, behind the scenes. But the people in the south of the republic, I want to say it, have been kept hostage by Al-Shabaab and incompetent pseudo-political warlords of the kind that we have today. When I went to Kismaya and I spoke to young people, they were as energetic as those 5,000 people that Ahmed talked about. So the distinction between the people of the south and the people of the north, we have to marry that to the security context in which they find themselves. They are identical as human beings. Second thing about Aden. Why didn't he? Well, here I'm responding to the question of Egal. By the way, somebody else has to write about Egal. I'm not going to be able to write about Aden, about this, about this. Why don't you write about him? That's the challenge to you.
Do you remember the book launch? Someone asked you, why don't you write about Michael Mariano?
Yeah,
It's endless.
But here's what I'm going to say. God bless Egal. He had his talents. He had his questions. Egal says that note about Abdurrazak. The Italians don't like him because he is not corruptible. Despite all the contributions Mohammed Ibrahim Egal made, he and Abdul Rashid, Ali Sharmarke, and Yasin Nur Hassan were the mothers of all corruption. And consequently, Aden knew that. And that's why he wouldn't appoint, even if he crossed the party lines. That's the last thing now.
30 seconds.
I don't buy what Laura said about clans. Nowhere in my work would you find the word clan or the mentality as an analytical object to understand the reality of the Somali people. Nowhere would you find that, whether it's this one or anywhere else. If you think that the old tradition of democracy that people wanted to go back to, that was undergirded by an economy that was premised on the household owning the means of production. In my first book on Somalia in 1989. When that was subverted, okay, then clan or tribe becomes political rather than cultural. Read Mahmoud Mamdani's book on citizens and subjects if you want to understand this. The minute you start with a clan as a unit of analysis and a political unit of analysis, it's a dead end. You will go nowhere. And so Somalis, beware about the concepts that you use. Thank you very much.
Good note to end on, I think. Yes, absolutely. Please join me in thanking all of the wonderful panelists, Laura Hammond, Professor Ahmed Samatar, and Abdi Samatar as well. And thank you for attending. Thanks. All right. Have a good night.